Okay, I've logged into Netlab and I've scheduled some time in the lab here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to exercises here. I'm going to go to chapter 2, which is the first exercise that you can do in Netlab. And I'm going to click change exercise. Okay, there's default configs. It says that there's default configuration files for the lab, and I want to load them into the lab devices, so I'll click yes, so that we get the default configuration files loaded. Now you can see here that they're loading, that is, and you can click the status tab to keep an eye on what state they are in loading up. So you can see here loading configuration file, loading configuration file, loading configuration file. Okay, I'll go back to topology. This is the lab that we're going to do. It involves a router up here, 2 firewall routers here, 2 switches, and then 2 clients here, right? If you need to see the instructions, which you will, right, there's a PDF that you can open up right here, show lab content, that will open up all of the instructions for the lab. Okay, so I've already opened it up and printed it out so that I have something to go by. Now, let's see status on how we're doing. Okay, we're still loading. Once we're done loading, we'll get started, and let's see here. Now, these PCs have already loaded and they're online. So what we can do is we could configure the IP addresses on the PCs. Now, the default configuration files should be in place for these devices here. They should already have their interfaces configured, and they should have some static routes that will enable communications. But the PCs do need to be configured, so I'm going to configure those now. So I'll click on this PC. And I'll double click over here, open up the local area connection, the NIC. I'll go into the NIC and set the IP address. Now the IP address for this machine needs to be 192.168.1.3, and the gateway will be, the router is at 1.1, and I'm just going to set the DNS to be the same, although I'm not sure that I need to do that, but I'll do it anyway. Okay. Alright, now that I've got that set up, I'm going to click on PCC and configure its NIC. Highlight TCP/IP and then I'll put in the gateway for that device. Okay, now I have both PCs configured with IP addresses. Now that we have the second PC's IP address configured, I'm going to go back to our topology of all our devices, click on status, and see that everything is up. So now what I can do is I'll go to PCA and I'll open up a command prompt, and first I'll try to ping the router, and I can ping the router, and then I'll try to ping the other client to see if I can ping all the way across the network. And if I can ping all the way across the network, which I can, That is a good sign. That means that PCA could ping its gateway right here, this router on the fast Ethernet 01 interface, and I could also ping the PCC over here, so the ping was able to traverse all the way across 1, 2, 3 hops, 3 routers, reach the PC, and then come all the way back on 3 hops. And so I know that these routers have IP addresses configured, they must, and they also must have static routes configured, so we're at a good starting point to start our lab. Now, another thing that I want to mention before we get started, and this can be a kind of a saver, a lifesaver if you're doing a lab in Netlab, and that is you probably want to save your configuration files for your routers and your switches with about 10 minutes remaining, in 10 or 15 minutes remaining in your lab time. So if I click on save, I will just click save, save, save. I can put a date here on the different configurations, or I could just put one right here and save all of the routers and switches configurations. And here's another important point. They're going to ask us in this lab right away to change some settings on the routers, on these 2 routers, R1 and R3. When we change those settings, we have to be careful of one thing, and that is, if we scroll down here, for us to connect through Netlab into these routers and switches, the routers need a console password of Cisco and enable secret password of class. So if the lab asks us to change the password to, let's say, Cisco 12345, and we leave it that way and save the configuration, we will not be able to connect back into the routers when we try to reload and pick up where we left off. So whatever you want to do, if you're going to change these settings, make sure you change them back on the routers and switches before you save your lab. Otherwise, you won't be able to pick up where you left off when you try to reload at a later time. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into R1, and I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. When you click on R1, it opens up a session, basically a telnet session, to the router, right? And now I click enter, and you can see I'm in the router. Now I'm going to go to preferences, and I'm going to change the font size so that it's easy to see for this lab. So I'll change it to 18, and now you can see the command prompt pretty big, right? So one of the first commands that they want you to do is type configure terminal, right? Hit enter, okay? And now you're in global config mode, and they want you to do this command, security passwords min-length, right? And set the length of the password to the recommended amount in the curriculum, which would be 10 characters minimum. Now, 10-character password is much more secure, but remember what I said right here. When you clicked save, it told you that the console password needs to be 5 characters, and it needs to be Cisco, and the secret needs to be 5 characters, and it needs to be the word class. So if we do that, we'll get locked out of our router. Even if we save our configuration file and it tries to reload later, we will get locked out. So what we're going to do is we'll go back to topology here, and I'm going to put in, instead of 10, I'm going to put in 5. But I'm going to remember that Cisco intends for the password length, a secure password length, to be 10 characters. Okay. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do the enable secret now. Enable secret, and in the lab, in the PDF that comes with the Chapter 2 Netlab, it's Chapter 2 Lab A, Securing the Router for Administrative Access, they recommend the password Cisco 12345, right? But we know that it needs to be for this Netlab, right? And for us to be able to connect back in, we need to do class as the secret password. Then we'll be able to get back in later. So I'm just going to do that. All right. Now I'm going to configure the passwords for the different ports and on the router. So mainly the console port, which is the main configuration port when you initially start up a router, the auxiliary port for dialing into a router through a modem, and the virtual access lines or VTY lines, which are used for Telnet and SSH. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'll say line, and this is right in the lab, and I'm just following the instructions in the lab, just giving a walkthrough to help for the students that are new to Netlab. I'm going to do line console 0, which gets me into line configuration mode. And then I'm going to do password. And instead of using their recommendation of Cisco console or Cisco con pass, I'm going to do Cisco, because that is the password that we need to get back into the router later. Okay, and then I will do a timeout scenario, exec timeout 5. So exec timeout 5, which stands for 5 minutes, and then 0, which stands for 0 seconds. Okay, so we've put in line console 0 for the console port. Password is going to be Cisco. We're going to have a timeout time of 5 minutes and 0 seconds. Now we're going to put in the login command. And then, after we put in the login command, we're going to type in logging synchronous, which will enable us to not be interrupted when we're putting in commands by the router output, by, let's say, some type of output like maybe an interface going up or down won't interrupt you when you're typing in your commands, which can be pretty frustrating. Okay, so now we need to do the other lines. So for line, let's see here, line AUX 0, line auxiliary 0, it's going to be the same thing. Password Cisco, and then exec timeout. We'll time out of our connection after 5 minutes 0 seconds, and we'll put in the login command, which will allow us to log in with just this password, and then also the logging synchronous command, which won't interrupt our session. All right, and now we'll do the line VTY, virtual terminal access for Telnet and SSH. There's 5 different lines that we can configure virtually, and we'll also put in password Cisco and exec timeout of 5 minutes 0 seconds and the login command. And we don't need to put in the logging synchronous command on the VTY lines, or maybe even the auxiliary lines, because they don't come across the telnet session, I don't believe.